Good day to everyone and welcome. I'm Gary Leach, president of Lambda Alpha International, and welcome to our Global Initiatives Program. This is a program put together by a committee headed by Richard Cook out of our Vancouver chapter. And thank you to Rick and his committee because they've done an excellent job of putting together a fine series of programs, many of which include some recipients of grants from our Land Economics Foundation, as is the case today. Our Land Economics Foundation president, John DeVries, is going to introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. Thank you. John?
Good, thank you, President Leach. And welcome attendees, LAI members and others who may have joined us. We have a very hot topic today. The topic of what's happening with zoning in the United States in particular, but in Canada and other areas as well. For those of us who grew up through a planning route, I think there's been an increasing distress about how zoning has been captured in too many places by NIMBY voices that have used it more and more to restrict the provision of multifamily housing, more affordable housing, sometimes group homes, so on and so forth, much to our dismay as professional planners. So the reaction to this certainly has been the recent strong interest by cities and states in what's being called upzoning. In other words, taking away the priority that Euclid and Ambler gave to single family zoning and trying to take us back to some of the more basic health, safety, and welfare criteria of the origins of zoning in the New York Housing Act. So with that as a brief preface to the issue, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mai Nguyen, who is Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and Director of the Design Lab at the University of California, San Diego. Mai is an award-winning researcher, authored and is focusing on social and spatial equity issues, and particularly her interest is in housing, immigration, and climate change. She has been board chair for the Urban Affairs Association, president of the Faculty Women's Interest Group for the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, and the founder and the administrator of Planners 2040. You all need to sign up for this one, a Facebook discussion group with over 2,400 planners across the globe. And Mai was able to tackle this in the midst of her transition from the University of North Carolina to her new role at University of California, San Diego. Her work was continued at UNC by Atticus Yamarillo, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I would emphasize the University of Chapel Hill is in fact the recipient of the LEF grant that Gary mentioned. His research focuses on federal, state, and local housing policy and planning influencing the long-term outcomes of low-income families with a particular focus on health, economic, and neighborhood outcomes. He's currently a Ford Foundation Pre-Doc Fellow with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and previously worked as a researcher for a variety of housing and community development organizations, including the Center for Urban and Regional Studies, the Minnesota Housing Partnership, and the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. I'd be remiss if I didn't give a nod to Professor Emil Malizia, who, Emil, I know you're signed up for today, and didn't want to intrude on these panels, on these distinguished panelists, but we do appreciate your facilitating this research, the institutional challenges of conducting this research through the University of North Carolina. Emil is a professor and was a prior chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina. Without further ado, and without stealing any more thunder from the issues we're going to talk about today, Mai, please start the presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. And hi Emil. So many of us have heard about this sort of movement towards eliminating single family zoning, right? Minneapolis did it, the state of Oregon did it, California somewhat did it, but it is definitely a movement across the country. Now, some places have eliminated single family zoning, but other places have stopped somewhat short of just eliminating single family zoning and have instead adopted large scale upzoning. And it's different. It increases density. It it creates some land use changes, but doesn't necessarily eliminate single family zoning. And that's what I want to talk about today, because it's so rare that places do this. Historically, very few places have had large scale upzoning. I think the city of Chicago is one example that actually did this. So when the city of Durham decided to implement this policy and conduct large-scale upzoning, we said, well, how do market actors actually respond, right? So the policy gets implemented, but it relies on market actors to actually do what the policymakers want them to do. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I just also want to recognize our research assistant, Ruby Brinkerhoff, who participated in this research and has been very much engaged, and we couldn't have done this without her. So we're going to go through today some background about this study, background about the city of Durham, provide some local context. The policy that was implemented was called Expanding Housing Choices, or EHC. It was an amendment to the Unified Development Ordinance. And then we're going to give some preliminary findings, because we are not completely done with this research. There's much more work to be done, and then tell you about what we're going to be doing next. So what is upzoning, right? It's the removal or relaxation of land use regulations that really limit housing density and the type of housing within neighborhoods. Now, oftentimes when cities, communities implement upzoning, what they want to do is to increase the supply, density, and diversity of housing within certain zones. It's also sort of, the idea would be if you did increase the diversity, let's say smaller homes or ADUs, then you would produce more affordable homes also, right? So that's sort of a next step in terms of the goals. And then some cities think that it'll reduce segregation, because smaller homes, more affordable homes, you'll get more diversity of households. Racial and ethnic minorities may move into smaller, more affordable homes. Lower income families might be able to move into these homes, and then that would reduce segregation. And then it would improve environmental sustainability, because we're not building further and further out, but we're actually building infill and also in urban neighborhoods. So, but what we know very little about is the reactions of market actors. There's very few studies that actually look at market actors and how they respond to these upzoning rules. And so who are the market actors? They're developers, they're construction firms, they're design firms, architects, homeowners that may actually take advantage of these new zoning changes, landowners, right? And so in order for these upzoning changes to have their expected effect, these market actors need to build new homes and also adopt the zoning changes the way that they're intended, right? However, we don't know whether or not market actors actually respond in the way that policymakers predict. So is upzoning strong enough incentive to actually produce more housing, more affordable housing, a diversity of housing? Are other local reforms needed, right? Sometimes these are very limited in terms of their policy changes. So are other types of local regulations needed to change also in order for these upzoning changes to be effective? And then what are the challenges to actually achieving the goals of upzoning for market actors? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So our study is located in Durham, North Carolina. If you don't know where that is, it is near Raleigh, North Carolina, one of the fastest growing cities, metropolitan areas in the country. I believe Raleigh was the fastest growing city between 2000 and 2010, and still one of the fastest growing between 2010 and 2020. So a very vibrant, growing metropolitan area. Durham is an industrial city. But it's very quickly transitioning to tech and high education, high skilled economy. It's often considered to be an eds and meds economy because Duke Hospital is located in Durham also. And the population is booming. It is rapidly growing. The city is projected to double in population by 2045. And there are serious concerns about displacement of low-income minority households and gentrification in the downtown neighborhoods. And that's driving why the city is interested in these upzoning changes. So our current study, what we decided to do was to interview these market actors, to ask them what they thought about these policy changes, and then to understand why they are behaving in the way they are in the short term, because this policy was adopted in 2019. In October, we only have about a couple of years of data to actually measure how market actors respond in the short term, right? And so I think this is instructive for other places that are considering these upzoning changes to understand what happens in years 1 and 2 after these changes. So we interviewed so far 14 market actors, and we are continuing our interviews so that we actually get more information. But even with 14, we're starting to hear the same things over and over again. And with qualitative interviewing, that's when you know that you might be reaching some saturation point if you're not getting new information from your interviews.
Okay, so I think it's my time now. So I'm going to go over just briefly kind of the planning process underlying the zoning reform, EHC, and then I'll get into kind of some of our main preliminary findings. So since this was a pretty large zoning reform in Durham, it was a pretty long process to materialize. So it first began in June 2018 with a public participation process. So the city distributed a survey to about 1,200 residents throughout Durham and asked them their preferences about zoning, their different sort of concerns about upzoning or increasing density in the city's urban core, and what they would like to see happen if the city did change zoning reform. So a part of the survey, about 47% of respondents said they were open to new housing types, and 63% said they were open to duplexes. So the survey participation process really helped establish that many of the residents of Durham were open to zoning reform and a little more density in the downtown area. So with that sort of information in mind, the local planning staff went ahead and created a zoning reform amendment. And they started to publicize different options for the zoning reform amendment to the public. So they specifically communicated it to local elected officials in the city council, and as well as the county board of commissioners, because Durham has a city and county boundary that are directly overlap one another. So there's a lot of coordination between city elected officials and county elected officials. So after they did this, they finally refined the proposed amendment and they passed it through the local city commission and as well as the county commission. And it was called the Expanded Housing Choices Amendment to the Unified Development Ordinance, or EHC. So what does this amendment actually do? So kind of the big key changes, the big goal that the city had in mind is they wanted to achieve 140 new housing units per year through this new zoning amendment. So the interviewees that we talked to have a separate permitting process than the regular permitting process. It's known as the EHC permitting process. And that's the 140 units they want to see more of, is going through that permitting process. And that's also how we identified our interviewees. So the EHC reform specifically relaxes restrictions around ADU developments. So before there was a lot, ADUs were permitted, but there was a lot more restrictions around them. Now you can build an ADU anywhere on your lot. There's no parking or special use permit requirement in order to develop an ADU. And they kind of allowed for larger maximum sizes of ADUs, all of which they hoped would make it more desirable to build accessory dwelling units. They also relaxed infill standards and kind of clarified some key points of the infill standards. So now 2,000 square foot lots are allowed, and you could have a building on that square footage lot of 800 square feet, as before the lot requirements were much larger and the building requirements were also much larger. So they're allowing small lot homes and small lot buildings to be built. And now duplexes and small lot homes are allowed universally in the urban tier of the city. So the urban tier of Durham is actually this area in bright yellow right in the center of the city. The rest of the area that is outlined in red or has green and blue and yellow, that is the broader county of Durham again. So, and then the outline around the light yellow is the Durham city boundary. So it's important to note that the zoning reform really only applies to kind of the urban core, whereas the rest of Durham remains largely suburban, and a lot of it is also protected environmental land and recreation activities. So the goals of EHC, like many other upzoning policies, are to manage urban growth, promote social equity, and then most importantly, to increase housing supply and affordability. So there were some community concerns with the upzoning policy. Some folks worried that there would be negative environmental impacts, increased impervious surfaces, and more runoff due to denser development, that it would disrupt neighborhood character. So Durham has a lot of very nice single family homes and neighborhoods, and they were worried that it would disrupt that community character. And then there were also some concerns that upzoning, although it aims to combat gentrification in a way, that it would also stimulate gentrification by making it easier for developers to build kind of high-rise luxury developments. So with all of these community concerns and goals in mind, we went out into the community and we talked to a variety of different housing market actors, so developers, design firms, homeowners even, who are building ADUs, about what their experience has been navigating this new process and kind of what their feedback is for the city, if any. So we have kind of 6 key findings that we wanted to highlight today before we get into some discussion. So the first thing that we're finding is that a lot of folks emphasize that ADU development still remains a challenge. So one of the quotes that our interviewees gave was, 2 things are always a challenge: the cost of construction and the availability of financing. So one thing we heard from a lot of our interviewees is that ADUs are actually quite expensive to build. They can be up to $200,000 to build. So it's almost the cost of building a new home. And because they're so expensive to build, it's difficult to rent out those units if they were interested in renting them at an affordable rate. And it's also difficult to kind of increase property values through them. So some homeowners do see them as a desirable way to build property value, but they're still not economical for a lot of homeowners to build, just given high construction costs, which of course was not helped by the COVID-19 pandemic increasing costs of everything throughout the United States. Another challenge with ADU development is right now Durham has a requirement where you have to have a separate water and sewer connection from the main building on the premises, so the main house. And that can be quite the expense for developers and folks to kind of overcome. So that was a bit frustrating for some of the folks we talked to, especially because it didn't seem like there really needed to be a separate sewer or water connection. One point that someone brought up in our interviews was there's a lack of financing options. So typically you might take out a construction loan or another sort of loan to build an ADU development, but that's not available for a lot of folks through ADUs. So a lot of people are taking out equity loans on their homes or just paying in cash for these ADU developments. So again, due to the lack of financing options, it's very hard for lower income or even moderate income households to afford ADU development on their lot. You know, all this said, all of the people we talked to though emphasize that the EHC zoning reform certainly helps. They think it's a step in the right direction, but noted that there are still challenges to building ADUs that might limit the ability of the policy to increase density and housing supply. Another key finding we found is that ADUs are mostly for personal use, and there's not a lot of rental market expansion happening from them. So one of our interviewees said, I kind of put 2 and 2 together and talked to some of my clients. Everybody is wanting to add value to their downtown houses. So folks who are building ADUs, most are just in the downtown area, which is close to Duke University. It's also close to the main commercial and recreational hub of the city, as well as some hospitals and other desirable locations. So these are pretty high value homes already to begin with. So these are the folks that have the ability to afford ADU development and really see ADUs as a way to build their property value by adding another building, not necessarily as a way to rent out to the community or a way to add more affordable housing to the city's housing stocks. So a lot of the folks we talked to who are building ADUs said they're for personal or family use. So for friends visiting, perhaps they'll have a in-law move in there someday, but they're not really for private market renters. That said, there was some desire for folks to rent out to Duke University staff and students. That said, we didn't see a lot of folks who had a desire to rent them out at affordable rates to things like Section 8 voucher holders or other lower income households. So our third finding is that EHC is not a silver bullet for all development barriers. So as one of our interviewers said, we'll have 3 different departments chime in on a driveway design we have, and each one might contradict each other. So throughout the city, EHC definitely relaxed parking requirements and made it possible to build narrower driveways in lots of the cities, but there are still parking requirements in effect in certain neighborhoods. There's also height limitations and setback rules. So the ADUs can only be, I believe, up to 25 feet in height. And in terms of setback rules, there's not, the reform changed the setback rules. There are none anymore, but they still want all of these different small lot homes and ADU developments to be consistent with the character of the surrounding neighborhood. So in areas where they have large street facing front yards, there's still in effect a setback requirement that can make it difficult to develop. And then another thing that came up with a lot of our interviews was that it's difficult to work through non-planning departments through the different permitting and requirement processes. So a lot of folks had trouble working through engineering, through these kind of unique developments. They had issues working with the design review board or other groups like that. So that there's still challenges in the general development process that the city could potentially consider addressing going forward. That said, we want to be careful here. We have yet to actually talk to city staff. So we're very interested in hearing their perspective on these matters. So at this point, it is a bit of a one-sided discussion, and we're aware of that. So our fourth finding is that what people build and where people build are both changing. So initially, after the policy was implemented in 2019, there wasn't a whole lot of development occurring, but over time, this has picked up steadily. So the number of permit applications is increasing. We have some of the most recent data available to us in this graph on the bottom, and it shows the average number of EHC permits per month. And over time, it's definitely starting to pick up. So immediately, it didn't result in a huge development boom, but over time, we're seeing much more development occurring. We're also seeing more neighborhoods where these properties are being built. So before it was really concentrated in the downtown area, and now it seems that the permits and the buildings are slowly fanning out over the city. That said, there has been some concern that lower income neighborhoods are seeing more development through these EHC zoning changes, and therefore that the policy might be contributing to gentrification. But that said, it's very hard to tell whether that's the case or not, because this is a very early policy. So it's hard to tell if displacement is occurring or what other sort of impacts it's having on neighborhoods. So our fifth finding is that market actors are skeptical EHC will create affordable diversity housing stock. So a lot of folks said they didn't really think that they were giving more housing to people. It's just giving people with houses that get more space. So folks who already have large yards and room to build ADUs or to subdivide their lots are really benefited by this zoning change. That said, folks did feel it was a step in the right direction. So we're moving towards the right direction, but diversification of housing choice is not the word I would use, as one person put it. So townhomes and cottages are still hard to build through this policy. So duplexes are allowed, but other sort of dense housing types, there isn't a clear pathway in place to build those. A lot of folks felt that affordable housing production is unlikely through the zoning change alone, again, because construction costs are quite high in general. That said, folks were not entirely pessimistic. They certainly thought that it could build more affordable housing in the long term and in surprising ways. So some folks thought perhaps that it will reduce displacement in the city and therefore help preserve sort of naturally occurring affordable housing properties, other things like that. So, folks are not overly optimistic about the fact that this policy will increase housing affordability, but think that, again, it's a step in the right direction. So then for our sixth finding, this was kind of one of the surprising ones that we weren't really expecting, but EHC provides unique benefits to small and mid-scale builders. So a lot of the folks who are making use of this new permitting process, the zoning change, are small and mid-scale design firms, construction companies, who are being able to build their business through this new upzoning change. Because arguably these smaller scale projects are more manageable for them, and therefore they're very attractive to them. The flip side of that is we're seeing fewer large-scale developers who really specialize in developing large single-family homes and subdivisions participating in this upzoning process. But all that said, I think the big thing that we took away from some of our interviews is that folks are hopeful that upzoning will attract unique design-based solutions for housing building that small and mid-scale firms are really on the cutting edge of, and that it will attract more construction talent to Durham because there's more opportunities to build housing. So with kind of those high-level findings in mind, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Mai to discuss some of our conclusions and then go through our next steps.
Thanks, Atticus. So, just to summarize some of the key findings, key takeaways so far in this preliminary study. These upzoning changes are a good first step, but there needs to be much more coordination across different departments in the city. This is according to our interviews of market actors. And streamlining their permitting process can be also helpful. It takes a while to actually get a permit approved. There are other considerations in order to actually make upzoning changes successful, right? Construction costs, lack of financing options. And so there are other actors that also need, or other institutions that also need to be on board or finding ways, solutions to make this, if our goal is truly affordable housing, to actually make it affordable. And then our next steps are more interviews with market actors. We're also going to interview key city staff. Those are being scheduled right now because we want to hear their perspective on this, on whether or not there is coordination. Maybe it's just a perception from market actors, but city staff have a different perspective, or not. Maybe they don't talk to one another. Maybe these departments are working in silos. And then we're also tracking neighborhood changes, right? Since this is short term, the longer this program has been implemented, we can start to see how these zoning changes are actually changing the character of the neighborhood, the type of housing that gets built, the demographics within the neighborhood. And so we're very much interested in those topics. And then implications for this study. These zoning changes take time to take effect, right? If you saw the graph of permits that initially there were very few permits that were being submitted, but after 2 years, after a year or so, it really picked up. And so, don't expect immediate changes. And don't expect market actors to respond quickly. They kind of have to understand the policies and how to actually take advantage of them. It would be, if the city streamline permitting for smaller and maybe even medium-sized developers, they will probably be more likely to take up these types of developments, right? It's not going to be the big developers. Implementing these types of upzoning changes is always a challenge. So iterating on it, right? The city hasn't really iterated, even though there are these challenges. And I think once they hear our results, they may consider some changes, but I think it needs constant evaluation and also iteration on some of these large scale upzoning changes, that it's not a one-time effort, right? What we'd like to do for future research is to track neighborhood changes over time, to actually engage with residents and community groups in these neighborhoods, in these upzoned neighborhoods, to see what their perceptions are, their experiences are with these changes, and then conduct a long-term study of housing affordability. Does upzoning actually slow down housing appreciation in some areas, or produce more affordable housing? Like what are the impacts to affordability? Our preliminary research suggests that housing it's not really producing affordable housing, and perhaps it's actually solving some of our other social problems, like housing for the aging, right? Families that have aging parents now with ADUs, they can move them in. They, we've heard from some, and I'm in California, so I've heard from ADU developers that actually a lot of people are using ADUs as a retirement strategy. They move into the ADUs and rent out their main house so that they can get some income and travel and do other things. So, maybe there are unintended consequences, unintended impacts of upzoning that we haven't really considered. And I think that that's an area for future research also. So with that, I think we will open it up to conversation and discussion and turn it over to John.
Okay, thank you, May. Addie, that's great. And we look forward to your continued research over the spring on some of these other issues. One question that has just come in was, has there been any, or will you be looking at how ADUs can be utilized as short-term rentals, the whole Airbnb kind of thing? I guess this is kind of in the vein of, would this allow extra income to residents in a particular area if they can add this style of unit?
So we asked the city of Durham if they track whether or not these ADUs become rental units, and they don't. And so the other way to actually get this data is to actually interview the homeowners and ask them if they are utilizing the ADUs for short-term rentals. And so that would be a next step. Another way to do this is there is some data that is available about ADUs by census tract, and you could track whether or not those places that are receiving more permits, these permits because of upzoning, are also seeing an increase in Airbnb rentals. So that's something we've talked about. We're certainly looking at it. The data aren't quite there yet to actually conduct this analysis.
Good. I'll pitch one here to Addie's direction, and that is, being a good Midwesterner, Addie, you know Minneapolis and some of the challenges in North Minneapolis. Some of the early results there have shown a trend not so much to new construction, but subdividing existing homes, and homes being more units being created by rehabilitation than by new construction, with some positive impacts because of increased number of units available to the market, but also maybe some negatives in that it raises the rental rates in the area too. Is rehab going to be part of your continued research, and is rehab encouraged by this style of ordinance as well? In other words, subdividing and rehabbing?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is it's not like explicitly encouraged by the city. But one of the interviewers we talked to, he said a point of frustration for them was that they're kind of taking a lot of time properties that might be dilapidated, vacant, whatever you may be, and they're turning them into newer duplexes. They're turning them into other sort of small lot homes. So that's one of their business model is taking these underutilized parcels and trying to upgrade them to a better use. So although perhaps the property might not be affordable in the long run, they still felt like they were providing some form of community benefit by kind of taking these properties and upgrading them. But I don't think that explicitly the city has encouraged that sort of work. It's just what makes the most sense based on the housing that's available in Durham. And then, that's, I think, mostly what we're seeing at this point. So.
Very good, thank you. Another question we've had is taking it in a different direction, and that is, can ADUs be developed by the property owner and then severed from the existing lot so that in fact they could be separately titled as a way of attracting buyers, owner occupants by increasing density, but some sort of way of obtaining separate title to these units is another way of encouraging more of them.
Yeah, in Durham, I don't think that is possible. You would have to split the lot in order to do that. And however, because I'm in California, actually, they are allowing homeowners to split their lot and build other units, including, they wouldn't call them ADUs, it'd just be another unit, right? And that is allowable, but you have to have lived in your home for 3 years or more in order to do so. So you can see that there are different rules across different places, different states, and they are implementing upzoning in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, my understanding is that if you did want to do that in Durham, you would have to then have a ADU that conforms to the small lot building requirements, which is a whole nother set of requirements in terms of parking and in terms of design and things like that. So perhaps you could do it if it just worked out that way, but I think it would be a whole separate process. But we haven't heard of anybody wanting to do that at this point in our interviews.
Very good. We have another question, and I'm wondering if your research will end up touching on this, is besides relaxing the zoning, if you will, to allow this kind of density or development, are there any other incentives that cities are trying to bring to the table alongside this relaxation of the regulatory environment to encourage more densification that you either run across or you anticipate being able to find in your additional research?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm sure there are incentives, but I think that zoning really is the biggest impediment, right, to density, right? When we have these single use zones, especially when it comes to residential, that is really the big inhibitor of increased density. There are things like inclusionary zoning for affordable housing that can increase density. So density bonuses. Cities will say, well, we'll allow you to build more units, but some of them have to be affordable, right? You've heard of inclusionary zoning probably. And so that has been implemented for decades in places around the country, including California and Massachusetts. So there are ways in which cities incentivize using density bonuses.
Just to share a couple comments in case not everyone is taking a look at the chat boxes. We had one comment: in California, researchers found that only 8% of the new ADUs are being used as short-term rentals. So, although more affluent homeowners are more likely to list their ADUs as short-term rentals than those making less than 100,000. So it sounds like that confirms what you've initially found out too, that they're not being rented so much as being used in an accessory way by the owners. And
I think to add to that, John, homeowners are seeing this as a good investment, right? They're diversifying their portfolio by investing in housing. So increasing the square footage of your house at a time in which housing prices are escalating, right? So they know that their house will appreciate in value. So let's just say the cost of building an ADU is $300 per square feet. And by the time they sell, they know that it'll go up to $500 per square feet. So they're really thinking about this as an investment rather than just, hey, I can rent this out and make some rent on it, but I can use it, expand my square footage, and also see it as diversifying my financial portfolio.
Okay, that's great. One other comment, helpful comment that one of our listeners said is that Ohio and Virginia law are allowing for sublots not platted off a public street. So I don't know if that's something that out of your researches could be even proposed or suggested in Carolina, what the taste for that might be, but it might be worth seeing what the experience of Ohio and Virginia has been so far, trying to add that additional flexibility to the scene.
We'd love to read about that if we can get some information about Ohio and Virginia regulations.
we did have a question, and you really kind of touched on this, but how are financiers looking at this? Are people simply building this with their own savings or surplus income, or are these really bankable, or are these loan worthy kind of investments? Are any of the financial institutions choosing to participate?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, what we've seen in Durham right now, I think from what I've read and heard just from colleagues is that it's pretty localized how financiers are working on these sort of things. So in Durham, it doesn't seem that financiers really know how to, potentially create construction loans for these projects or other things of that nature. So in lieu of those sort of formal systems, I know that folks are really just going out of their own pocket or taking out equity loans on their homes in order to kind of build these different properties, and that's specific for the ADUs. I believe with the small lot construction and duplexes, they can still do kind of typical financing projects, but it's the ADUs that are really the oddballs there. But, I have a close friend who works in finance in Minneapolis, and they're doing a lot of stuff to develop sort of like cooperative financial models where multiple people are owning a single plat and other things like that. So I think we're in the very early stages right now of adapting sort of our typical homeownership and construction financing options to allow for these sort of developments. But really, it seems that ADUs are going to be the tough one, or the one that they don't quite know how to address at this point.
Yeah, our initial findings suggest that it's either cash on hand or HELOCs, home equity line of credits, that people are using for ADUs and not getting a separate loan necessarily.
Right. Yeah, and that of course is a question related to some of the earlier ones about could you do separate title on some of these regulatory. By the way, we do have a comment. Just share Lee Einsweiler, those LAI members, says he's happy to share national zoning experience, and he's given his lee@code-studio.com. So you might want to tie in with him, Patty, and my. So thank you for that, Lee. Okay, here's a related question, and that is, are duplexes typically owned by one owner who rents a unit or two owners? And I'll let you all tackle that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so duplexes, I think what we're seeing so far is that it's kind of rental companies that are building these at these points and then renting them out. We haven't seen in our interviews a lot of folks who are building a duplex and then living in one side and renting out the other half. That just hasn't been the model so far that we're seeing. So I guess, that's the short answer for that question.
The interesting thing about duplexes is that they have the same requirements as building a single family house. Is that right, Atticus? Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a single family house. It looks like a single family house, but is split in half. And all of the setback requirements, all of the, zoning requirements are pretty much the same. So although we've seen some interest in duplexes, it's not as much as ADUs.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you break the permitting data down by which type of housing they're building, it's mostly small lot homes followed by ADUs, and then just a very small fraction of those being built are duplexes at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. And I guess I'll kind of pitch this one to you, Maya. And there seems to be kind of an intersection here between the small house movement and the ADUs. From a design viewpoint, I know there's been a lot of innovative design work done around smaller footprint homes. More compact designs. Is there, from your design studio viewpoint, an intersection there that might be fruitful?
So I think that why market actors are taking advantage of the small lot is that land prices in Durham are still relatively affordable. It hasn't gotten crazy yet. And so they actually see that they can make a good return on investment by building on small lots and building small homes. That being said, I think that some of the restrictions of setbacks and facing the front of the street and all of that actually creates some restrictions on their design, their ability to actually create, you know, novel designs or unique designs or interesting designs. So I don't think that this policy necessarily is promoting better designs. It's not like the tiny home movement where, you know, people really took that as some creative license in building small homes. This is really just single family homes that just have a smaller footprint.
Okay, good. Either one of you might want to tackle this one. This reminds me, I spent some of my consulting career in South Florida, and a lot of builders there, given the culture, the more family culture, were providing grandma units or family units where an older member of the family could come in, share childcare, maybe address some health concerns by being able to be with the primary family. Does the ADU ordinances in Durham or others that you've looked at encourage just additions to existing structures to increase density as well as another tool?
So an ADU can be attached to the existing unit. It just has to have a separate entrance. So yes, so ADUs are being built as attached to the main house or detached. And some of the requirements are different, right? Like new sewer lines, new electrical, you know, outlets or boxes. So I think it just depends on whether you attach it or detach it. But yes, certainly people are taking advantage of the attached ADUs because it's sometimes easier to build.
Okay, that's very helpful because I have to confess my image of the ADU thing is detached. So this is more the experience we're seeing in Minneapolis then, is where they are adding units or subdividing existing structures. In which case the requirements for completely separate water, sewer, and so on do become a little burdensome. It would seem that even with a shared water sewer thing, that you could have separate metering to these units. Is that am I perceiving that correctly?
You could, although I don't know if Durham requires that. Interestingly enough, in California, for detached ADUs, they also have to be solar. So you have to put in solar panels to actually power the ADU. So, you know, it is not necessarily affordable to build an ADU. You really have to want that extra square footage and see the value in it. I don't think in the short term, renting out an ADU is worthwhile economically, right? You're not going to recoup the cost of the ADU.
There's been several comments about how can we find the how can we at some point read about the findings, and I know you all have already, we encourage you to certainly get these published in peer review kind of things, acknowledging the LEF support, but I know you've also been in discussion already to provide a keynotes article, so that'll be available to our LAI members, and in fact this recording will be posted so people can get informed, and we may have to bring you back at some point here to, there's a lot of things you're still going to be tackling yet this spring as you kind of pull out of the COVID umbrella that you had to work under. So
Yes. We
given
had a slowdown in January when Omicron hit and nobody was responding to us. So
yeah. And someone's mentioned we'd love to have you in person sometime to one of our land economic weekends. This fall, our land economic weekends will be in October, I think the 14th to 16th or other, in Los Angeles. So maybe we could at least get you
local.
kind of get you tied into that one. We historically had been presenting bringing grantees to present at our LUs and recording them and then making them subsequently available. But that might be an opportunity to do an in-person presentation and interact with some of our members. Let's see if we have anything else coming here.
I was going to say, I saw one comment about stormwater, a question about
Oh,
dealing with stormwater.
yeah, please. I did miss that one. Go ahead.
Excuse me. I think, what we've seen so far, it's fairly haphazard. So really the responsibility for building some sort of like retention pond on a property of a small lot is being left up to developers on a case-by-case basis. So developers noted that that was kind of something that they didn't expect, that there was like, each time they go through this process for a small lot home, they might be subject to different sort of stormwater management requirements on a case-by-case basis. So that was another kind of unanticipated thing where I think the city, perhaps didn't anticipate that being an issue, but it is something that the developers were aware of, and it kind of fits into engineering challenges of these homes, and stormwater management being another one that has gone largely overlooked.
There were some questions about taxes. So one, do municipalities provide any tax incentives for homeowners considering ADUs? Not in Durham, and I've not seen that anywhere, actually. And then there was another question about the tax implication of going from maximized lot development to neighborhoods now filled with lots with development potential. Will land values increase as a result? Yes, absolutely. Now that they see the potential to build on these smaller lots, the price per square foot is it's just gonna increase. There's gonna be speculation. These are very desirable neighborhoods in and around downtown. And I think this is what you might call the fiscalization of land use. When you change the ability of that land to be used for something else, that it actually changes the value of that land.
That's interesting because we've been primarily talking about adding units adjacent to or as part of existing homes, but does the district that you illustrated for us on the earlier map, does that allow for some
Infill.
by right higher densities on the infill lots?
So because they are allowing smaller lot development, so houses built on lots that are 2,000 square feet, which is very small, that'll increase those. There's some vacant lots or lots where people can split their lot because it's a large lot, and you can have a 2,000 square foot lot if you split off your home from some land. So it'll certainly increase the value of land.
You touched on this before, but there was a question about just in Durham, kind of what is the typical whole dollar cost of a detached, and I guess for that matter, an attached type of unit, and either detached on an existing lot or detached where you've got vacant property and people are now able to subdivide it more to a little bit slightly higher densities.
Addie, did you get some cost information from the market actors that you talked to?
Yeah, no, we actually haven't looked at that yet. So that'd be a good point to look at, going forward. And I think you can definitely look up some of the homes that are, being sold as small lot homes. But my guess would be that they're more affordable than your traditional single family home, but still not affordable, if that makes sense. So, I mean, I think in Durham right now, you can't really find anything for less than 250 to 300,000 would be the ballpark I would venture. So if you're truly a lower or moderate income person, that's still going to be a hard threshold to overcome. And, as Mai was saying before, these are in very, very desirable neighborhoods. So given the fact that they're so desirable, even though it's smaller square footage, I think you'll see plenty of folks who are willing to pay a high price tag for even a smaller home in those areas.
I know that you primarily have been focused on developers as actors. Any reaction from the neighborhood associations or the typical folks that show up at the zoning hearing saying not in my neighborhood? You see any softening of the NIMBY attitude in some of these desirable neighborhoods because of the quality or how these are designed, or that the public climate may be changing to some extent?
That's a great question for the city staff as we interview them, if they're getting any complaints, pushbacks. But given that these zoning changes have been implemented, there's no public process anymore, right? Meaning that you can build these units by right now, and you don't have to go through a public process. So it sort of mitigates some of that negative feedback, or even gives an opportunity for community members, neighbors to actually respond or oppose these developments. But we can certainly ask the city staff if they're getting any feedback.
And I would say, I think, the city was pretty strategic with this being their first step. They didn't, propose huge multifamily developments in single family neighborhoods. They proposed kind of small scale changes that were incremental. So, in the survey, if you look at the numbers, really a lot of folks were pretty open to duplexes, small at homes, things like that. There was less, favor for large homes in these neighborhoods. So I think they hit that balancing act well in taking this first step. And then one of our developers, he said that it's case by case basis on sort of NIMBYism on a development or project by project basis. So he had one property where the people were actually excited that it was being built next door. They saw it as increasing the value of their property. And they had another one where someone was upset and messed with their landscaping. So it's not kind of this general NIMBYism, it doesn't seem, that they're encountering when they're building these, but there are some folks who still have concerns and might not like them.
I think this has been fruitful to kind of catch you at this point in research, because we're sharing some questions that maybe that'll be of some value as you complete your research. And I'm always thinking, back to a picture's worth 1,000 words. If people haven't seen this kind of development in their communities, I'm wondering if in the research you could be accumulating some visuals, some pictures of the product, if not plans or floor plates or anything that would help people who are in communities where this hasn't yet taken hold, to see kind of what's resulting from these kind of changes, if that's possible.
Absolutely. We can go around taking pictures.
Yeah.
And even this is a data oriented audience you're talking to here. Even picking up some typical plans or whatever that may be
Sure.
public record, because I assume they still have to be filed with Durham to get the permits and so on. Yeah. Is there any aspect of this that we haven't touched on here that you hope to share with us today?
Not for me.
Got a pretty diverse group of questions today, so I hope we've touched on all fronts. I think with that, I'll turn this back to Gary. We try to stay punctual here, and we hope to see you in at least we'd love to see you in Los Angeles. Addie, we look forward to you and the keynotes article I know you'll be collaborating on. We're looking forward to, we certainly love to share with our membership any other places that you achieve some publication. We love to make those links available to our members and get the news of what you're doing out there as broadly as possible. So thank you for being with us today.
Right.
We look forward to hearing from you again in some format in the future. Thank you. Gary?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you. Gary,
Thank you.
Back to you.
Thank you, John. Great job moderating today, Addie, and my great presentation. We thank you very much. Look forward to hearing more news about our next webinar. Rick is working on it, and we'll be coming up with some dates soon.
Okay. Yep. Goodbye, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.